The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns and freshly painted picket fences. For retired Army Drill Sergeant Marcus Hayes, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful chapter after decades of service. He had spent 27 years in the military, shaping raw recruits into disciplined soldiers, but now, at 44, he was ready to focus on what mattered most: his 11-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan had been born with a neurological condition that affected his mobility. Despite the challenges, Ethan was a bright, determined kid who never let his disability define him. But as he grew older, their old home had become a prison of narrow hallways, steep steps, and tight door frames. Marcus had made the decision to move to Willow Creek, a quiet, picturesque community where Ethan could finally feel free. A place where he could ride his wheelchair without frustration, where the world wouldn't feel like an obstacle course. The house they moved into was perfect, a spacious single-story home with wide doorways and a flat yard. Marcus had already started making modifications, building a ramp for the front porch and widening the bathroom door. He was determined to make this house a home where Ethan could thrive. The neighborhood seemed idyllic at first. The streets were lined with oak trees, and the air was filled with the sound of children laughing and dogs barking. On their first day, a few neighbors had come over to introduce themselves, offering warm smiles and helping hands. It felt like the kind of place where people looked out for each other, where Marcus and Ethan could finally breathe easy. But then, Marcus met her. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and she lived directly across the street. From the moment Marcus and Ethan arrived, Margaret had been watching them like a hawk. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, her sharp eyes tracking their every move. When she finally approached, her smile was polite but forced, her tone dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "I was wondering when they'd finally sell this house," she said, her voice laced with something Marcus couldn't quite place. "It sat on the market for so long. I guess they were waiting for the right buyer." Marcus nodded, brushing off her comment. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he wasn't one to judge too quickly. But as the days went by, it became clear that Margaret wasn't just nosy. She was controlling. She was the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and she had a twisted sense of authority over the neighborhood. Margaret's first complaint came just 2 days after they moved in. Marcus had parked the moving truck in front of their house, waiting for the company to pick it up later that afternoon. Margaret stormed across the street, her perfectly manicured nails gripping a steaming cup of coffee. "That thing is blocking my view," she snapped, pointing at the truck. "I like to sit on my porch every morning and enjoy the scenery. I can't do that with a giant truck parked in front of my house." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "It's not in front of your house, Margaret. It's parked in front of mine." She folded her arms, clearly unimpressed. "This is a well-maintained community. We have standards here. I don't know how things worked where you came from, but here, we have a way of doing things." Marcus bit back the urge to roll his eyes. "The truck will be gone by this afternoon. Until then, I think your brunch guests will survive." Margaret pursed her lips, clearly fuming, but she didn't have a comeback. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, her coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her cup. The next morning, Marcus was up early, determined to finish the ramp for the front porch. He had spent years in the Army using his hands, and he wasn't about to hire someone for something he could do himself. With a sledgehammer, cement, and sheer determination, he got to work. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Marcus was sweating, his muscles burning, but he didn't care. This ramp was for Ethan, and nothing was going to stop him from making his son's life easier. But then, Margaret appeared again. She marched across the street, her arms swinging in exaggerated frustration. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp and dripping with irritation. "I was woken up by all this racket. Some of us enjoy a peaceful morning." Marcus glanced at his watch. It was almost noon. "Didn't realize almost noon was considered early," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I apologize if I disturbed you. I'm just making some accessibility improvements for my son." Margaret barely blinked at the mention of Ethan. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the half-finished ramp, and her expression twisted with disapproval. "You know, this isn't exactly in line with the aesthetic of the neighborhood," she said, letting out a dramatic sigh. A ramp? That's just going to look unsightly. Not to mention, it'll lower property values. Marcus stared at her, momentarily stunned. Lower property values, he repeated, forcing a chuckle. Margaret, it's a simple, functional ramp. Not a neon sign that says, "Welcome to an eyesore." But she wasn't done. "Look, I'm just saying," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "If your situation requires all these modifications, maybe you should have chosen a home more suitable for your son." Marcus froze. For a second, he thought maybe he had misheard her. But then she tilted her head, arms crossed, eyes narrowing like she had just made a perfectly reasonable statement. A slow, boiling anger settled in his chest. "You listen to me, Margaret," he said, his voice low but firm. "My son has every right to live in this neighborhood just like anyone else. And if you think for a second that I give a damn about your approval, let me stop you right there." Margaret's smirk vanished, but she didn't back down. Instead, she let out a fake, breathy laugh. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just that this community has a certain standard. You have to admit, all these changes you're making aren't exactly in line with your warped idea of perfection." Marcus stepped closer, cutting her off. "My son's ability to enter his own house safely is more important than keeping up with whatever delusional beauty standards you think the street has." Margaret's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, leaving Marcus to finish the ramp in peace. A few days later, Marcus received an invitation to the annual Willow Creek Summer Festival. It was a big tradition in the neighborhood, with food vendors, live music, and activities for all ages. Marcus was hesitant. After everything that had already happened with Margaret, he wasn't sure if putting himself in the middle of another neighborhood event was a good idea. But Ethan was excited, and Marcus didn't want to let his son down. The festival was in full swing when they arrived. Families were setting up blankets, kids were darting between booths, and neighbors were chatting in small circles. For the first time in a while, Marcus felt like maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what they needed. But then he saw her. Margaret was standing near one of the food stalls, already deep in one of her signature complaints. Her arms were flailing in exaggerated frustration as she berated some poor volunteer over what Marcus could only assume was some trivial inconvenience. Ethan stiffened beside him. "Dad, can we go?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus turned to him, his stomach tightening. Ethan looked uncomfortable, tense, already exhausted by the weight of this unspoken hostility. Marcus hated it. He hated that his son felt like he had to leave a public event because of one miserable person. "Let's just take a walk around first, all right?" Marcus said, forcing a reassuring smile. "We don't have to stay long." Ethan hesitated but nodded. They took a slow walk around the festival grounds, and Marcus could feel Ethan start to relax the further they got from Margaret. For the first time since they arrived, Ethan seemed to be enjoying himself. But then, Marcus saw Margaret again. She had moved closer to where Ethan was playing, now seated on a bench a few feet away. Her phone was in her hand, a video call open. Her laughter was light and casual as she spoke to someone on the other end. But then she noticed Ethan, and everything about her changed. Her face tensed, her jaw clenched, and she let out an exaggerated huff, rolling her eyes so dramatically it was impossible to ignore. She leaned into her phone, whispering something, shaking her head like Ethan's very presence offended her. Marcus's heart pounded. He knew Margaret, and he knew how easily she could turn a minor annoyance into something cruel. He started moving, pushing through the crowd, but he wasn't fast enough. Before he could reach them, Margaret shot up from the bench, her phone still clutched in one hand. Then, she stormed toward Ethan. Marcus moved faster, dodging between groups of people, his pulse hammering. And then, she started yelling. People turned their heads, caught off guard by the sudden outburst. Some parents instinctively pulled their kids closer, whispering among themselves. And just as Marcus broke through the crowd, he lost sight of them for half a second. But that was all it took. When he finally caught up, Margaret was no longer next to Ethan. She stood alone on the hill near the riverside, and Ethan was gone. A second later, panic screams erupted from the crowd. Marcus didn't stop to ask. He didn't hesitate. He ran. By the time he reached the water's edge, he already knew what had happened. His son was in the water. Margaret had pushed him, wheelchair and all, into the river. Every instinct Marcus had as a soldier, as a father, as a human being, kicked in at once. His body moved before his mind could catch up. The river wasn't fast-moving, but the current had already pulled Ethan away from the shore, carrying him further out before Marcus could reach him. Marcus lunged into the water, pushing forward with everything he had. The icy shock of it barely registered. He wasn't thinking about the cold. He wasn't thinking about the crowd behind him. All he could see was his son, drifting further and further away. His heart slammed against his ribs as he swam toward Ethan, his arms cutting through the water with frantic, powerful strokes. Ethan was struggling, his small hands reaching out, his face pale with shock. If he had still been trapped in the wheelchair, he wouldn't have had a chance. The weight of it would have dragged him straight to the bottom. But somehow, by pure survival instinct, he had managed to free himself from the chair in the initial fall. Marcus reached him just as his strength was giving out. Ethan's movements were slowing, his body trembling violently from the cold. "I got you, buddy," Marcus said, wrapping an arm around him and kicking back toward the shore. His muscles burned, the weight of Ethan's body making every motion heavier, but he didn't stop. Not for a second. By the time he dragged them both to the riverbank, a few bystanders had rushed forward, pulling them the rest of the way onto dry land. Ethan was shaking, his face nearly as pale as the clouds above. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Marcus wrapped his arms around him, pressing him against his chest, trying to transfer whatever warmth he had left. "You're okay," he whispered, more for himself than Ethan. "You're okay." And then he saw her. Margaret was standing just a few feet away, her phone held up, recording. She was grinning. For a split second, Marcus thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, she was smirking, smiling like she had just won some petty, twisted game. Marcus could hear the faint audio of her phone playing back the recording. She had filmed everything, and she was pleased with herself. Ethan had ruined her video, so instead, she made one of them. A slow, seething rage burned through Marcus's chest. This wasn't just cruelty. This was evil. And for the first time in his life, Marcus felt something he never had before, the kind of anger that makes a man want to destroy something. Margaret had no idea who she was messing with, but she was about to find out. Once Marcus was certain Ethan was breathing steadily, his trembling easing just enough, he gently passed him into the care of one of the festival volunteers. They wrapped a blanket around him, murmuring reassurances. But Marcus could barely hear any of it because his focus was locked on Margaret. His body moved before his brain could even process it. He stormed across the grass, his boots hitting the ground with force, every muscle in his body coiled tight with pure, undiluted rage. Margaret saw him coming. She didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her phone higher, holding it out between them like a flimsy shield, as if a screen would protect her from the firestorm she had just unleashed. "Whoa, easy there, big guy," she said with an infuriating smirk, like she thought this was some kind of game. Marcus stopped just short of grabbing that phone and throwing it into the river where his son had just nearly drowned. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Marcus's voice came out low, controlled, too controlled. Margaret, still shamelessly recording, gave an exaggerated shrug. "Look, it's not my fault your kid can't handle himself," she scoffed. "You know, I really don't think it's appropriate for someone like him to be out here. I just mean, this festival has a lot of activity. It's probably too much for kids like him. That chair of his rolled right off the hill on its own. Maybe if you actually watched him instead of playing hero, this wouldn't have happened." The air around them went dead silent. Even the distant sounds of festival goers faded into the background. Margaret let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Honestly, this whole thing is kind of funny," she muttered, shaking her head. "One minute he's up, the next splash. Bet you weren't expecting that kind of entertainment at a family festival." Then, as if she had just remembered Marcus was still standing there, her face darkened. She narrowed her eyes and sneered. "And yet, you just had to go and ruin the moment by pulling that piece of trash out of the water." Something inside Marcus snapped. He stepped forward, his presence looming over her, his voice no longer controlled. He went full drill sergeant mode. "You listen to me, and you listen good," Marcus roared, his voice booming so loudly it echoed. "That piece of trash is my son. And if I ever catch you so much as looking in his direction again, I swear on everything you hold dear, you will regret it." Margaret's smirk vanished. Her face drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to speak, but couldn't form a single word. Marcus didn't stop. "You think this is funny?" he barked, stepping closer, forcing her to step back. "You think nearly drowning a child is some kind of joke?" Margaret stumbled, her confidence cracking. The phone in her hand wobbled, her grip no longer steady. "You might think you run this neighborhood," Marcus continued, his tone dropping into a cold, deadly quiet. "But let me be perfectly clear. You do not scare me. And after what you just did, you're done here." For the first time since Marcus had met her, Margaret looked genuinely afraid. She didn't have a comeback. She didn't even try. She just stood there, frozen, as the weight of her actions finally caught up to her. Satisfied, Marcus turned on his heel and strode back to his son. Because Ethan was the only thing that mattered. And Margaret, she would be answering for what she did. The aftermath of the festival was a blur of chaos and tension. The police arrived, lights flashing, radios crackling as they stepped out of their cruisers. Marcus gave his statement, his voice steady but firm. He laid out the facts, pointing to the witnesses, the footage, and the damning evidence of Margaret's actions. Margaret, on the other hand, tried to spin her web of lies. She played the trembling, well-respected community leader, painting herself as the victim. But the evidence was against her, multiple witness statements, the footage of her recording instead of helping, and Marcus's unwavering testimony. In the end, the truth won. Margaret was officially charged with attempted murder. The realization hit her like a freight train. There was no talking her way out of this, no HOA board to manipulate, no passive-aggressive letters to send. Just cold, hard justice. As Marcus walked out of the police station that night, he spared one last glance at Margaret. She was still sitting there, staring blankly ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Hey, Margaret," Marcus said, keeping his voice low and calm. She blinked slowly, turning her head toward him. Marcus tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. "You always loved controlling the neighborhood. I wonder how you're going to handle prison. You know, considering you don't get to choose your neighbors. Good luck with that." Margaret's mouth opened, but nothing came out. There were no more fake tears, no more excuses, no more smug arrogance. Just silence. And with that, Marcus walked out, stepping into the crisp night air, knowing that for the first time since moving into Willow Creek, Margaret was finally gone. And his son was finally safe. The days following Margaret Whitmore's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions for Marcus and Ethan. The once quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek was now buzzing with gossip, speculation, and tension. News of the incident at the summer festival had spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Marcus tried to shield Ethan from the worst of it, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers and sideways glances. Some neighbors were supportive, offering kind words and gestures of solidarity. Others, however, were more reserved, their loyalty to Margaret and the HOA making them wary of Marcus and his son. Linda, the neighbor who had invited them to the festival, was one of the few who stood by Marcus. She brought over a casserole one evening, her warm smile a stark contrast to the cold reception they had received from others. "I just wanted to check in on you too," Linda said, setting the dish on the kitchen counter. "How's Ethan holding up?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's coping. It's a lot for an 11-year-old to process. He's been having nightmares." Linda nodded sympathetically. "I can't even imagine what he's been through. But you're a good father, Marcus. You've done everything you can to protect him." Marcus appreciated her words, but he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. He had moved to Willow Creek to give Ethan a better life, but instead, his son had been subjected to cruelty and danger. Marcus had spent his entire career protecting others, but now, he felt like he had failed the one person who mattered most. Margaret's arrest didn't mean the end of Marcus's troubles. If anything, it only intensified the hostility from certain members of the HOA. Without Margaret's iron grip, the association was in disarray, and some of her loyal followers were determined to make Marcus pay for what they saw as an attack on their community. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a letter. It arrived in Marcus's mailbox one morning, typed on official HOA letterhead. The message was clear: The modifications Marcus had made to his property, the ramp, the widened doorways, were in violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. He was given 2 weeks to remove the changes or face fines and legal action. Marcus crumpled the letter in his fist, his jaw tightening. He had expected pushback, but this was beyond ridiculous. The ramp wasn't just a convenience. It was a necessity for Ethan. Marcus wasn't about to let a group of petty bureaucrats dictate how he cared for his son. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting, determined to confront the issue head-on. The meeting was held in the community center, a small, sterile room filled with folding chairs and a long table at the front. Marcus arrived early, Ethan by his side. He wanted his son to see that they wouldn't be intimidated. The room quickly filled with neighbors, many of whom avoided eye contact with Marcus. The meeting was called to order by a man named Richard, one of Margaret's closest allies. He was in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and a perpetually sour expression. "First order of business," Richard began, his voice dripping with disdain, "is the matter of unauthorized property modifications. Mr. Hayes, you've been notified of the violations. Do you have anything to say?" Marcus stood, his presence commanding the room. "Yes, I do," he said, his voice steady but firm. "The modifications I've made to my home are not just for my convenience. They're for my son, who has a disability. The ramp and widened doorways are necessary for him to live a normal life. Are you really going to stand here and tell me that my son's safety and independence are less important than your so-called aesthetic standards?" The room fell silent. Richard's face turned red, but he didn't back down. "This isn't about your son," he snapped. "It's about the rules. We all agreed to follow them when we moved here. You're not above the law, Mr. Hayes." Marcus clenched his fists, but before he could respond, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. "Actually, Richard, I think Mr. Hayes has a point." All eyes turned to Linda, who had stood up, her arms crossed. "We're supposed to be a community. That means looking out for each other, not tearing each other down. Ethan is a part of this neighborhood, and he deserves to feel welcome here." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but Richard wasn't swayed. "This isn't a debate," he said coldly. "The rules are clear. Mr. Hayes has 2 weeks to comply, or he'll face the consequences." Marcus sat down, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't the end. The HOA was determined to make his life difficult, and he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The tension in Willow Creek continued to escalate. Marcus and Ethan became the targets of subtle but persistent harassment. Their trash cans were knocked over, their lawn was littered with debris, and one night, someone threw a rock through their living room window. Marcus was furious. He had dealt with bullies before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about Ethan. His son was already struggling to recover from the trauma of the festival incident, and now, he was being subjected to even more cruelty. Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed security cameras around the house, determined to catch the culprits in the act. He also reached out to the local police, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. One evening, as Marcus was tucking Ethan into bed, his son looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Dad," Ethan whispered, "are we safe here?" Marcus's heart broke. He knelt beside the bed, taking Ethan's hand in his. "We're safe, buddy," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." But deep down, Marcus wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. The neighborhood that was supposed to be their sanctuary had become a battlefield, and Marcus was running out of options. The breaking point came one rainy night. Marcus was woken by the sound of shouting outside. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the window, his heart pounding. A group of teenagers, neighborhood kids, were standing in his yard, laughing and throwing eggs at the house. Marcus stormed outside, his anger boiling over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice echoing through the night. The kids froze, their laughter dying in their throats. One of them, a boy no older than 16, stepped forward, his face pale but defiant. "We're just having fun," the boy said, his voice trembling. "It's not a big deal." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "Fun? You think this is fun? You're terrorizing my family. Do you have any idea what my son has been through?" The boy's defiance wavered, and he looked down at his feet. "We didn't mean. It's just. Get out of here," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "And if I ever catch you near my property again, you'll regret it." The kids scattered, disappearing into the night. Marcus stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, the rain soaking through his clothes. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Ethan standing behind him, his face pale and scared. "Dad?" Ethan whispered. "Are you okay?" Marcus knelt down, pulling his son into a tight hug. "I'm okay, buddy," he said, his voice softening. "I'm just tired of all this." Ethan buried his face in Marcus's shoulder. "I'm scared, Dad. I don't want to live here anymore." Marcus's heart ached. He had fought so hard to give Ethan a better life, but now he was starting to wonder if they had made a mistake. Maybe Willow Creek wasn't the safe haven they had hoped for. Maybe it was time to leave. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. He needed help, and he knew where to find it. He reached out to a lawyer, a former Army buddy named James who specialized in civil rights cases. James listened intently as Marcus explained the situation, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. "This is more than just a neighborhood dispute," James said when Marcus finished. "This is discrimination, plain and simple. They're targeting you and your son because of his disability. That's illegal." Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. "What can we do?" James leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We can fight back. We'll file a lawsuit against the HOA for violating the Fair Housing Act. We'll expose their discrimination and hold them accountable. But it won't be easy. They'll fight us every step of the way." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid of a fight. Not when it comes to my son." The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The HOA was forced to defend their actions in court, and the media quickly picked up the story. The once quiet neighborhood was now at the center of a national debate about discrimination and disability rights. Marcus and Ethan became symbols of resilience, their story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. But the battle was far from over. The HOA fought back with everything they had, dragging the case out and trying to wear Marcus down. But Marcus wasn't alone. Linda and a few other neighbors rallied behind him, offering their support and testimony. Even some of the teenagers who had harassed Marcus came forward, admitting that they had been pressured by their parents to target the Hayes family. The trial was long and grueling, but in the end, justice prevailed. The court ruled in Marcus's favor, declaring that the HOA's actions were discriminatory and ordering them to pay damages. The ruling sent a clear message: discrimination would not be tolerated, not in Willow Creek, not anywhere. With the lawsuit behind them, Marcus and Ethan finally had a chance to breathe. The neighborhood was still divided, but the hostility had begun to fade. Some of Margaret's loyal followers moved away, unable to accept the changes, while others stayed, determined to rebuild the community. Marcus and Ethan decided to stay as well. They had fought too hard to let a few bad apples drive them away. Instead, they focused on building a new life, one where Ethan could thrive without fear. Marcus continued to make improvements to their home, this time with the full support of the HOA. He even started a neighborhood initiative to make Willow Creek more accessible for people with disabilities, ensuring that no one else would have to go through what they had. Ethan, meanwhile, began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, and he started to smile again. He made new friends at school, kids who didn't care about his wheelchair or his past. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he belonged. One evening, as Marcus and Ethan sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, Ethan turned to his father with a smile. "Dad," he said, "I think we're going to be okay." Marcus smiled back, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy," he said, "we're going to be just fine." And for the first time in a long time, Marcus believed it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.